the waters of the Nile turned into blood. Thousands of frogs invading every corner of Egypt. Swarms of locusts destroying entire fields, and a terrifying darkness covering the land. 10 deadly plagues unleashed upon Egypt. But what was God trying to teach with all this power? And how did Pharaoh react to this overwhelming force? After centuries of oppression, the people of Israel were about to experience a divine intervention that would change their lives forever. Egypt, ruled by the powerful Pharaoh, refused to free the Israelites from slavery. That's when God sent Moses with a clear message: "Let my people go." But Pharaoh, with his heart hardened, defied God's command. He refused to listen, even when Moses warned of the consequences. And then, the unimaginable happened. God began to display his power through 10 devastating plagues, each more severe than the last. The goal was clear: to free his chosen people and show Egypt and the world who truly held the power. The plagues were not just punishments, but demonstrations of divine authority and a response to Pharaoh's stubbornness. Each plague brought chaos upon Egypt, testing how long Pharaoh would resist. At the heart of ancient Egypt, the Israelites had been enslaved for over 400 years. Pharaoh, considered a living god, believed his control over the people of Israel was absolute. However, God heard the cries of the Israelites and sent Moses and Aaron with a clear mission: deliver a message to Pharaoh demanding the release of his people. But Pharaoh, arrogant and unbelieving, refused to comply. The clash between God's will and Pharaoh's stubbornness resulted in the unleashing of a power like nothing the world had ever seen. The 10 plagues were a direct response to Pharaoh's defiance and his refusal to set the Israelites free. But these plagues were not merely acts of punishment. They carried a deep spiritual purpose. Each plague directly challenged one of Egypt's gods, proving that Yahweh was supreme over all. God wasn't just delivering his people. He was revealing his ultimate authority over creation. Moses would soon become the leader who would guide Israel out of Egypt, but their journey to freedom would only begin after Pharaoh had faced the consequences of his rebellion. The first plague, water turned to blood. At God's command, Moses struck the waters of the Nile with his staff, and the entire river turned into blood. Not just the Nile, but all the rivers, lakes, and water sources in Egypt were affected. The fish died, and a terrible stench filled the land. The Egyptians were desperate, digging along the riverbanks for fresh water, but to no avail. The life-giving waters had become a curse, and Egypt was left in despair. The second plague, a horde of frogs flooded Egypt. They emerged from the rivers and covered every inch of the land, invading homes, palaces, kitchens, and even Pharaoh's chambers. The Egyptians were overwhelmed by the sight and sound of frogs everywhere. Pharaoh, disturbed, promised to free the Israelites if Moses would remove the frogs. But once the frogs died, filling the land with a foul smell, Pharaoh hardened his heart again and broke his word. The third plague. Gnats. With a simple strike of Aaron's staff, the dust of the earth turned into gnats, swarming people and animals alike. The tiny insects were everywhere, causing misery and discomfort throughout Egypt. Even Pharaoh's magicians admitted defeat, unable to replicate this miracle. But despite the discomfort and chaos caused by the gnats, Pharaoh refused to relent, hardening his heart further against the will of God. The fourth plague. Swarms of flies filled Egypt, invading homes, temples, and even the royal palace. This time, God made a clear distinction. The flies plagued only the Egyptians, while the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was untouched. The buzzing of flies brought disorder and filth to every corner of Egypt. Yet despite the clear signs of God's power, Pharaoh remained obstinate, refusing to let the Israelites go. The fifth plague, livestock disease. God sent a deadly plague that struck the livestock of Egypt. Horses, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats were wiped out in large numbers, causing massive economic devastation. Yet just as with the flies, the livestock of the Israelites was spared. Despite the loss of wealth and livelihood, Pharaoh's heart grew harder, and he still would not set the people free. The sixth plague. Boils God instructed Moses and Aaron to throw handfuls of soot into the air, which turned into painful boils that broke out on the skin of the Egyptians and their animals. The boils were so severe that even Pharaoh's magicians could not stand before Moses. The suffering was intense, but still Pharaoh's heart was unmoved. His refusal to submit to God's authority continued to bring suffering upon his people. The seventh plague, hail and fire. God unleashed the most destructive plague yet, a storm of hail mixed with fire that rained down from the heavens. The hail destroyed crops, trees, and killed anyone or anything left outside. The storm ravaged the land, shattering buildings and burning fields. Pharaoh, witnessing the sheer power of this plague, begged Moses to stop it, promising again to let the Israelites go. But once the storm passed, Pharaoh reneged on his promise, and his heart remained as hard as ever. The eighth plague, locusts. Following the storm, God sent a swarm of locusts that devoured whatever the hail had left behind. The locusts covered the land, consuming every plant, tree, and crop, leaving Egypt in ruins. The once fertile fields were now barren. Pharaoh, desperate, asked for Moses' help once more. But after the locusts were removed, he continued to refuse the Israelites their freedom, sinking deeper into his stubbornness. The ninth plague, darkness. Without warning, a thick darkness fell over Egypt, lasting for 3 full days. It was so intense that no one could see or move. The darkness was overwhelming, a tangible sign of God's power. Yet in Goshen, the Israelites had light in their homes. Despite this miraculous division, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He could not see, not only physically but spiritually, as he continued to resist the will of God. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn. Finally, God sent the most devastating plague of all, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. From the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoners, no house was spared. God instructed the Israelites to mark their doors with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over them. The cries of grief and mourning filled Egypt that night. It was this plague that finally broke Pharaoh's will. Devastated by the loss of his own son, Pharaoh ordered the Israelites to leave Egypt immediately, setting them free at last. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not only demonstrations of God's power, but also a message of his justice and purpose to free his people. Pharaoh's stubbornness brought unimaginable devastation upon himself and his nation. Yet throughout the chaos and destruction, God protected his people, guiding them toward freedom. Each of these plagues challenged the gods of Egypt, showing that Yahweh reigned supreme over all creation. These were not mere punishments. They were lessons to demonstrate that no earthly power could stand against the will of the true God. In the end, what seemed impossible became reality. Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth, was forced to release the Israelites. The journey to freedom wasn't easy, but God kept his promise. This story serves as a reminder that no matter how great the opposition, God's plan will always prevail. He is a God of justice, of power, and of deliverance. And so the people of Israel set out toward the promised land, free from the chains of slavery, knowing that God was with them every step of the way. Now that you've heard this powerful story of the 10 plagues, take a moment to reflect. How has God shown his presence in your life? Are there moments where we, like Pharaoh, are resisting his call? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know how this message has touched your heart. And remember, just as God freed the Israelites, he can also free you from any situation you're facing. Trust in his power and in his promises. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like the video, Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear this word today. May God bless you abundantly and guide your steps with wisdom and faith. Until next time.